All right, guys, we're going back into the Revolution here with a man named Patrick Henry. And actually, we're going to go back in time a little bit to March 23rd, 1775, where he addresses the Second Virginia Convention. And this is done in direct opposition of the lieutenant governor, who was loyal to the king. The lieutenant governor was a loyalist. He was appointed by the king. He had British regulars at his disposal. So they actually met in Arlington, Virginia, which was not the capital at the time. It was a little more inland, to avoid any run-ins with the lieutenant governor or British regulars. And what Henry does in this speech is he calls for the formation of militia or cavalry in every single county in Virginia. And this speech becomes more famous than anything just by his last words of "give me liberty or give me death." Now, this speech actually goes very far, inspiring many people, including George Washington, to fight for the American Revolution. It's actually this speech that really pushes Washington to attend the Continental Congress and to stand up as a potential leader in the Revolution, and eventually our commanding general. Speaking of Washington's army, it was mostly militia volunteers, not trained, very undisciplined. They were farmers. They were simple, common men that were just tired of the British crown pushing them around and abusing them. But the other problem is that most enlistment time in those days was 1 year. So every year, soldiers were coming in and out constantly. So Washington never had more than 17,000 soldiers in his ranks at any one time, which seems like a lot, but in a battle where you can lose upwards of 100 men at a time, that's really not a lot. I mean, you're going to want over 20,000, if not 30 to 40,000, to really be considered a strong force. Where we were struggling to keep men, and not to mention supplies, we had little food. Many soldiers would chew on tree bark or raw leather just to get some sort of nutrients, whereas England was hiring and paying other people to fight for them. And they paid a bunch of people called Hessians, who are mercenaries, people that are paid to fight. They're Hessians, and they're Germanic. They're from modern-day Germany area, and they were ruthless. And just with their numbers and their power, they were actually able to push George Washington out of New York City, cause him to retreat across the Delaware River into modern-day Pennsylvania. But Washington's able to recoup and plan a new attack. And he does this on December 25th, 1776. Yes, Christmas Day. And he actually does it on the morning of Christmas, after the Hessians had been celebrating Christmas Eve. They had drank a little too much, and so they were asleep Christmas morning. Washington marches into Trenton, New Jersey, and surprises the Hessians, killing or capturing over 900 soldiers. They took supplies, weapons, food, clothing, boots. I mean, many of George Washington's men would march barefoot or just with rags wrapped around their feet to keep their feet out of the cold snow. 8 days later, they go on to Princeton, New Jersey, and win another battle. This really got Washington's men inspired and motivated, and they were feeling proud. This is one of the most famous images of George Washington, and it's called Crossing the Delaware. So you see him crossing on a boat. He's standing right here, nice and tall, his sword at his side. They're pushing chunks of ice out of their way as they cross the Delaware River. You even see his horse here in the background on another boat. A massive undertaking. The British were getting scared, and they come up with a new strategy. And their strategy is to literally cut the head off the snake. What does that mean? If you think back to Ben Franklin's image, join or die, dating back to the Albany Plan of Union, it was reused again during these days. What was the head of that snake? New England. So the British wanted to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, specifically Boston. Boston was seen as the match point, the spark of revolution. Everything seemed to have started and originated in Boston. And they figured to do that, they would seize the Hudson River Valley, control the Hudson River, north to south, from New York City all the way up to Canada, and that would isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. They had a plan to rendezvous in Albany, New York. That's to meet up, is what rendezvous means. So that General John Burgoyne, who would come down from Canada, Lieutenant Colonel St. Leger would come from Lake Erie in the west, and General Howe would come up from New York City in the south. So what does this look like? Oh, sorry, Lake Ontario. So here's Albany, New York, and you can actually see Saratoga right here, which is where the actual battle happened. Now, Burgoyne, again, was coming up from Canada, coming down. St. Leger was going to come from Lake Ontario from the west across Mohawk River. And then Howe was supposed to come up from New York City up the Hudson River. Had that worked to their advantage, that would have been 3 armies meeting in one area and really doing some serious damage to the colonial army in the area. But it failed. Failed for 2 reasons. One, General Howe decided not to go to Albany. He figured, well, southern New York is pretty well in British control anyway. So he's going to go to Pennsylvania and try to capture George Washington and the city of Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress was meeting. He failed. But just by him going to Pennsylvania and not following the plan, took his army completely out of the equation. St. Leger is scared away. There were rumors of a large army moving towards him. Those rumors were false. They were created by General Benedict Arnold, who had told many of their Native American allies in the area to spread rumors of a massive army heading Leger's way. Leger turned his army around, got back on their boat Lake Ontario, and left, which leaves General John Burgoyne alone to fight the entire Continental Army outside of Saratoga, New York, which is outside of Albany, New York, the capital. Arnold is able to turn around and meet up with General Gates, and now 2 armies, 2 fighting forces, are going against Burgoyne. Together, they're able to defeat Burgoyne on October 17th, 1777. You see this, one of the portraits of that battle, which unfortunately is false. Many of these portraits, they're symbolic, but they're not really accurate. You see here is General Horatio Gates. Over here, we see General John Burgoyne, and this is supposed to be Benedict Arnold. However, there's an issue with that, and we'll talk about the issue. This should not have been Benedict Arnold. I'll explain that in a moment. Saratoga became the turning point of the war. Why was it called a turning point? Because the tide turned. England was now more on the defensive. America, the colonies, were gaining more and more ground, winning more and more battles, and European countries noticed this. Specifically France and Spain. They started to think, hey, Americans, they can actually win this war and knock the British down. The British were the power of the world at this point, and France and Spain would have loved nothing more than to see England knocked off their high horse. But they came at a price. Benedict Arnold was shot in the leg. He was injured, which is why there's no way he could have been standing in this portrait. He was shot in the leg. He would have been in a hospital bed having surgery, having a bullet pulled out of his leg. But this injury leads him down a very dark path of resentment. He starts to get angry with Congress because he doesn't feel like he's being paid well enough, compensated well enough. He doesn't think that his military prowess, which is incredible, which was tremendous. Arnold at this point was a hero, was an American hero, and he didn't feel like he was being treated as such or paid as such. And truth be told, he was being influenced by his wife, a woman by the name of Peggy Shippend, who was a British loyalist. And he goes down this really dark path to treason, where he actually gives the plans of West Point. Now, West Point, in those days, was a huge fortress on the Hudson River, preventing the British ships from going up and down the river. West Point today is the United States Military Academy, where the Army sends people to become the top generals of the Army. But while Arnold was recovering, he was the commandant, he was the commander of West Point. And he works out a deal with a man named Major John Andre, who was the head of British intelligence, to turn over West Point. He was going to move his soldiers around, move troops around in the area, make West Point as weak as possible. He gave Andre the plans to West Point so they knew exactly where to attack, exactly how to get in. The problem is that Andre was caught in southern New York, outside of Yorktown, turned over to the right people, and it was discovered that Arnold had given him these plans. Arnold found out that Andre was captured, and he escaped and climbed aboard a British vessel. Andre was tried and hung for espionage, for being a spy. But to this day, Benedict Arnold's name is one and the same with traitor, treason. He was hated after this for many, many years, and actually a couple years later would actually lead an attack on his hometown in Connecticut wearing a British uniform. Washington himself was beside himself. He thought of Benedict Arnold almost as a second son. So this betrayal hurt Americans, deeply hurt Americans. Which is why to this day, if you ever hear the name Benedict Arnold, it's usually not a good thing. It's usually not in the best of way. Check back later, and I'll have another screencast for the follow-up and the conclusion, the American Revolution.